For about a week now, there have been protests going on inside of Cuba. Many people are upset with legitimate issues that are plaguing the country, particularly as it relates to COVID and medical supplies. However, the situation is much more complicated than many people would have you believe. While there has been a very vocal small minority who have been gaining all the media attention in the United States, the vast majority of the Cuban people actually stand against the protesters with very good reason. However, if one were to listen to FedTube, otherwise known as BreadTube, one might get the idea that there was a genocide going on in the country. This all began when Cubans expressed a legitimate grievance against the government over the handling of the COVID pandemic. Essentially, their hostility is over the lack of necessary medical equipment. This is a fair criticism, and something people have a right to be angry about. Of course, Cuba is suffering from a shortage of medical supplies. They are currently under a decades-long embargo by the United States that would prevent them from purchasing them. They also are unable to buy the necessary materials to even manufacture them themselves. Now, some people have suggested that they could put more resources into producing them, but given the embargo, I question how effective that would actually be. The problem is this is the perfect moment for the United States and other imperialist powers to initiate what they call a color revolution. It's a tactic in which the imperialist power usurps a legitimate grievance and takes over the protests and makes them about overthrowing the government. This is what has happened in Cuba. What began as a peaceful protest against real problems inside of Cuba has been taken over by agitators being funded and controlled by the United States, who have now turned them into a very violent, dangerous people have gotten hurt in order to push some kind of anti-revolution sentiment. What's the problem is that these US-backed protesters have completely overshadowed and taken over the ones that are protesting against a legitimate grievance. And this is exactly how color revolutions have worked in the past. One of the ways you can tell is by the flags that they are waving at these large gatherings. Obviously, Cubans wouldn't be going around waving American flags, asking for America to invade the country and put more embargoes and sanctions on the country. You know, Cuba largely has been a very large supporter of the phrase "Yankee go home" for a reason, because that's one of the bases. That's one of the bases of the Cuban Revolution is an anti-imperialist, anti-colonial struggle. But yet, when you see these people protesting, they seem awfully pro-US for people who are supposed to be patriots of their own country. Counter-protesters in support of the revolution took to the streets to quash attempts by the US to oppose the revolution. The president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, called on those who support the revolution to make their voices heard. He came out along with them into the protests. Such a thing has never been seen in the West, where the presidents hide from them. That's how much faith the revolution has in the masses, and how much the revolution is the masses. So, of course, the Western media, controlled by imperialist interests, have gone out of their way to make it look like this is the biggest uprising against a so-called dictatorship in many decades, and has gone to considerable efforts to push that narrative. CNN has gone out of its way to show images from gusanos in Miami and pass them off as rebelling Cubans. I wasn't aware that 8th Street in Miami simultaneously existed in Havana. The hashtag SOSCUBA has been thrown around social media with a great deal of disinformation. Largely, a lot of it propped up what I suspect to be CIA-controlled accounts, or at least from the Pentagon, or at least people who know that they are being dishonest in order to attack the socialist government. Now, here's an example of some of the misinformation that's being put out. If we were to take their word for it, the Egyptian rebellion against Hosni Mubarak in 2011 is also taking place in Cuba today. The Western imperialist media is also deliberately ignoring the theft and rioting that has been going on in the country. The anti-revolution assets are being portrayed in the media as peaceful when they are certainly not. So when the police crack down on them, they cry brutal oppression. Predictably, FedTube has come down on the side of U.S. imperialism, this being of surprise to absolutely no one given their history of supporting U.S. imperialism against the right to self-determination that a lot of these countries are trying to carry out. So what we do see once again is BreadTube essentially outing itself as fascist forces, while continuing to denounce anybody who opposes U.S. imperialism of being the red fascist evil tankies of real-world socialism, and not the imaginary one on the internet that tells you to vote for Biden. Some, like Vosh, have already proclaimed some nonsense like, whenever a third world country has a protest, tankies cry CIA. Well, Groomer, we can clearly see the difference between the two protesters and can determine their origins. Vosh also ignores the fact that the CIA has a very long history of making these attacks on countries, which he apparently denies happened. On a personal note, Vosh, don't act like you know the third world. All you do is essentially spout State Department propaganda that forwards imperialism and colonialism in the third world. Just as sickening has been the support for the embargo against Cuba carried out by people who proclaim themselves to be leftists. Obviously, if you're a leftist, you oppose having food and medical supplies being sent to people. I'm being sarcastic. I have to point that out because some people on the fake left are pretty slow on the uptake, and will run around saying that I support the embargo. Let me be clear. You cannot say you stand with the Cuban people and also support the embargo, the thing that's blocking them from buying food and medicine. What you are really saying when you support the embargo is that you support a genocidal policy that will deliberately kill innocent people. All of it, because the United States wants to force out a legitimate government chosen by the people in order to put in a puppet government to sell that country to the interests of U.S. businesses. Again, if you support the embargo, you are a genocidal piece of trash. Already the media is trying to use these events in Cuba to boost jingoism against other countries on the U.S. imperialist hit list. Without any evidence, and even rational thought, the media is claiming that China and Russia will invade Cuba to attack the protesters, and of course, it will be a bloodbath. You know, like when the U.S. police murder people for very minor or no reasons. Gutierrez Boronat, 55, the Cuban Democratic Directorate, a Miami-based organization that advocates for supposed democracy in Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, said he fears a violent crackdown. We are asking for the international community led by the United States to intervene to protect the Cuban people from a bloodbath and to bring this regime to an end, he said during a news conference. Some on social media have outright been calling for Cubans to be killed with sanctions. So what's the latest development in this situation? The protests are already over. Those who were protesting in order to bring about the end of the revolution inside of Cuba have already failed. The amount of people in support of the revolution, not necessarily in support of everything the government does, but those in support of the revolution have already come out and silenced those who have attempted to overthrow the legitimate system. Now, there are already people inside of the country, U.S.-backed forces, who do all kinds of egregious things just to try to destabilize the Cuban government. Not only does the U.S. have a very long history of carrying out terrorism and killing people in the country, and 600 failed attempts to assassinate Castro, there is currently one that is rather bizarre in my eyes, and that is people deliberately getting AIDS in order to strain the Cuban healthcare system. I'm not kidding. That's actually a real thing. You can You can Google that. It's utterly bizarre. But once again, of course, we see BreadTube simply denying that these things exist and simply forward this U.S. State Department narrative in order to justify the murderous crackdown on these countries, particularly with sanctions. Sanctions and embargoes seem to be one of the things that the people in BreadTube seem to support. See, the thing is, it's not a direct form of violence. It's not cracking someone's head open with a baton or dropping a bomb on them. It's something that's a more passive killing effect. So they get to feel like it's somewhat of a non-violent policy because it's not a direct violent action, which shows not only the disingenuousness, but the cowardice of BreadTube as well. But that is the kind of situation that we are going to face. That is the kind of ideological war that's going on right now. The Radlibs, in support of the current U.S. government, and probably the previous one as well, at least when it comes to foreign policy, are people that should be combated in the arena of ideas. And they should be shouted down for the reactionary forces that they are. Thank you for watching. If you like this program, then please head over to my Patreon page and set up a monthly donation. It's your donations that keep this program running. Also, if you would like, please rate, comment, subscribe, and share in various social media.